Hi, this is Corey Johnston, and today's lesson is going to take place in the 14th and 53rd Psalms. Now, these have more identical with them than they have differences between them, but the differences are significant, and the occasion and context, which we'll delve on more extensively as we make our way over to the 53rd one, are significant. And as far as I know, there are no repeated chapters verbatim throughout the Bible, but in the Book of Mormon, they do often repeat from the verbatim from the King James Version several chapters of Isaiah, Malachi, and even the Sermon of the Mount, Matthew 5 through 7. We're not going to comment on that book because we only teach from this book, but we do recommend it as a read for anyone who has not already done so. So the opening, the title actually of the 14th verse is "To the Chief Singer of David." So David was the author of this psalm. He composed it. He was a musician in addition to a king and a prophet and a man after God's own heart. And the reflections of his heart were dedicated and oriented towards God. So one way to look at the Psalms in comparison to the Torah or the Pentateuch is that the book of Psalms is arranged into 5 separate books, but it's combined in one for the sake of solidarity. And if the first 5 books of the Old Testament are Yahweh's message to man, then the Psalms can be thought of as man's message to Yahweh, and it was inspired by the Spirit, so it wasn't men apart from divinity that was able to dedicate these songs and poems to divinity. But the 14th chapter takes place in the first chapter, which spans the range of the first 41 chapters of Scripture. David is the author of 37 in the first book alone and 73 of the 150 Psalms. And there are other psalm authors, Asaph, Ethan, Moses. I used to think Solomon, although I recently reinterpreted the 72. I recently reread the 72nd Psalm, and I interpret it now as a message from David to Solomon. But the 53rd takes place in the second book of Psalms. In the contextual adjustment, we're going to comment on that as we delve into there. That being said, we're going to open with the opening verse of the 14th Psalm, which reads, "The fool has said in his heart, there is no Yahweh. They have done corruptly. They have done an abominable deed. There is no one who does good." So there are 3 words which translates in the Hebrew tongue as fools, and the one in this specific location is Nabal, which is also incidentally the name, and Nabal translates as brutish, a brutish type of fool, and this certainly describes the name of the character encountered by David in 1 Samuel, the 25th chapter. He was a foolish and brutishly foolish man. But our English word of fool comes from a Latin word which translates as bellow. So the fool often says things without thinking and makes the thoughts of his heart, which are not necessarily discerning or insightful, known to all in earshot. And the heart is where he says it in, and the heart is intimately connected with the mouth. The thoughts and meditations of the heart form the expressions of the mouth. And so the fool, what a foolish thing man is apart from Yahweh. He is our omniscient source of wisdom, who also endowed us with the rational and creative capacities that we uniquely amongst the animal kingdom can enjoy and exercise. So it's really a species of abject foolishness to deny his existence. Even those without special revelation can come to an awareness through natural revelation in nature and the conscience, general revelation rather. And because they deny the existence of Yahweh, that gives them a license. There's no moral compass, there's no moral standards, there's no moral judgment. We don't have to answer for the life that we lived at the judgment. That leads them free to do corrupt and abominable deeds, and the word translated as corrupt indicates putrid or defiled. It's often used to describe the state, the deteriorated state of rancid milk. And the application of this indictment is universal. There is no one who does good. So the thoughts and intents of man's heart are invariably oriented towards evil, as we read of in Genesis 6:5. Yahweh looked down from the heavens on the sons of mankind to see if there was a wise one, seeking Yahweh. So he is the purveyor of his creation. He is omnipresent. He is capable of being everywhere at once, wherever he wants to be, however, in whatever form he assumes. And what motivates this investigation is to see if his creation are paying homage to the one who created him. And as we read in the next verse, there is not a single one, unfortunately. They have all turned aside. They have together become filthy. No one is good, not even one. So they have turned wayward. We are sheep. We are oriented to stray. We have a wandering nature. And apart from our good shepherd, we have no guidance. We have no provision. We have no reliable or steadfast source to keep us grounded in the straight and narrow. And filthy is the state of impurity, which describes it's not a physical filth, but a moral filth. And no one is good, no, not one. Paul repeats this in Romans 3:10. Romans 3:10. So once more, the indictment is universal. There is no human that is good, at least apart from the one who is intrinsically good, that being Yahweh. Have all the workers of wickedness no knowledge, who eat up my people as they eat bread, and do not call on Yahweh? So from their lack of knowledge, their refusal and repudiation of the existence of Yahweh springs the ignorance, which translates into social injustice. And social justice was very much a concern as embedded in the Mosaic law. Yahweh is concerned for the most vulnerable and weak and oppressed and defenseless members of his society. And this, the Israelite upper class was supposed to have a concern for. Many of them sadly didn't. And they ate up their people as they eat bread. This is a physically relatable analogy to the purveyors of injustice that is rampant throughout the world, not just in Israel's culture, but in our own, in every generation, every culture since human history. And they do not, of course, the question, and do not call on Yahweh, the answer is they do not, because if they did, they wouldn't be doing the things that they were described as doing. There they are in great fear, for Yahweh is with the generation of the righteous. So even though the indictment is universal, Yahweh does have a people who are devoted and committed and attached to him, those who abide in him. And he who fears Yahweh, the fear of Yahweh expels all other fears. There is nothing left to fear when we fear the one who made us. And you would put to shame the counsel of the poor, but Yahweh is his refuge. So the image and the symbolism of refuge is frequently abounds throughout the book of the Psalms. I believe in most famously, or at least most immediately springing to my mind, is Psalm 46:1. And the poor have their refuge, they have their security, and they have their protection. Even if they are bereft of security and protection in the life that they now live, they have the eternal protection of the one who made them. And the counsel of the poor that would not be admitted to most ruling circles because the poor are thought too ignorant and too degraded to contribute to the counsel of any nation. Oh, that the salvation of Israel would be given out of Zion, when Yahweh turns back the captivity of his people. Let Jacob rejoice. Let Israel be glad. So even though this isn't classified as a messianic psalm, this is a clear messianic allusion in the closing verse of this psalm. And he also looks ahead to the captivity, which would come some 500 years or a little over 400 after his reign and rule. His rule would constitute a spiritual golden age, and that of his son Solomon would constitute a material and geopolitical golden age. But Solomon embarked on the path of idolatry, which basically tore the nation asunder. It split into two kingdoms, the northern kingdom of the 10 tribes of the north and the kingdom of Judah, aligned with Benjamin. And so he's looking for this. There is a redemptive purpose for them going into captivity, and this ultimately points to the final and full salvation, which Yahweh sent in the form of his son, who was a biological descendant of David. And for this, Jacob and Israel, Jacob is and Israel are one and the same. Jacob was the birth name of the grandson of Abraham, and Israel was the name he earned, and they have cause to rejoice and be glad that their Redeemer is going to come. Now, the 53rd Psalm reads, the title reads, "To the chief singer on sickness, a psalm of David." So we have a little more information from this one than we do its predecessor. This would have been set to the tune, which would have been familiar to its immediate audience as sickness. We don't have the slightest idea what the notation or even instruments which contributed to this tune, but it was identified as a Psalm of David. In all likelihood, it was recomposed and recompiled at a later date, perhaps in celebration of Judah's deliverance from Assyria, of which we can read of in Isaiah 37. That is one of the most plausible hypotheses around it. So the opening verse reads, "The fool has said in his heart, there is no Yahweh. They have done corruptly, and they have done abominable unrighteousness." Now, in some translations, it reads only the fool. And to be clear, atheists are capable of doing good works, and Christians are capable of doing evil. But in general terms, those who have the guidance of God will be significantly less evil than they would be in the absence of him. And we also read abominable unrighteousness. That is a phrase that is foreign to its predecessor. An abomination is perhaps the most offensive and odious deeds that we can do in the sight of the Almighty, and they are always and invariably rooted in unrighteousness. And I also neglected to read, no one does good. So once more, the application of this indictment is universal. No one, that means all don't do good by the negative inverse proportion of that phrase. "Yahweh looked down from the heavens on the children of men to see if there is a wise one, seeking Elohim." So in this verse, we read that it's a wise one, so even one. And Abraham, in his petition to spare the city of Sodom and Gomorrah, he narrowed his request down from if there are 50 righteous men in the city all the way down till 10. We can read of this in Genesis 18. And Yahweh says, if there are even 10, I will spare it from the destruction which otherwise may come. So therein we may reasonably infer that there was not even a single righteousness who had not succumbed to the practices and sinful culture of that ancient center of iniquity. "They have all turned aside. They have together become filthy. No one is doing good, not even one." So there's an individual element and a collective element. The collective is the macrocosm of the individuals which collectively comprise it, and they are joined together. Now you become the people you surround yourself with. So in a culture that is prone to darkness and iniquity, the average citizen, the unfortunate fact is that they will perhaps be more prone to mimic the characteristics of the characters which are around them in their society. We Christians are called to be lighthouses in a dark and perverse generation, but that's why we have to keep ourselves at arm's length distance from the world and its ways, lest we become filthy and incapable of doing good works. "Have the workers of wickedness know no knowledge, who eat up my people as they eat bread, and do not call on Yahweh?" So not a whole lot different between that and its predecessor. There may be a word or two out of placement, but I don't have these side by side. But their lack of knowledge, their wickedness is rooted in their lack of knowledge, and this reminds us of the Socratic Platonic precept that virtue is knowledge, the idea being that a thief steals because he thinks he's doing good. Little does he know it's his ignorance that he may be benefiting himself, but he's not benefiting those around him, and his happiness comes at the expense of others. So, but Aristotle, I guess you could say, corrected the overly simplistic notion by saying that we do good by we become just by doing just deeds. So it's not enough to know. We have to act on that knowledge and listen to the better angels in our ears and do what we know is right, and not just know that it's right, but actually do it. They are in great fear, where no fear was, for Yahweh shall scatter the bones of him who encamps against you. You shall put them to shame, for Yahweh has rejected them. So this is an altogether a lot more unique material in this than in the 5th verse of the 14th Psalm, and also this is a 6-verse Psalm, whereas that of the 14th was 7. But they are in great fear where no fear was. The wicked flee when none pursueth, but the righteous are as bold as a lion. We read of in Proverbs 28:1, the idea being that there's no reason to be fearful, and Satan does win many battles without firing a shot or facing any actual opposition, because we are afraid of a threat which has no bearing in reality. But the fear of Yahweh, once more, is the fear that expels all other fears. So once you properly fear him, there's no reason or cause to fear circumstances, situations, enemies, or forces aligned against you. And but if you don't, then your bones will be scattered, and you will be rejected at the final judgment when it matters most. Those who reject him in this life, neglect to confess his name, we read of in Matthew 10:33, can only and rightly expect rejection at him at the judgment where it matters most. Oh, that the salvation of Israel would be given out of Zion, when Elohim turns back the captivity of his people. Let Jacob rejoice, let Israel be glad. So this is once more remarkably similar to the 7th verse in the predecessor psalm, the 14th one. And so even though this is not classified as a the general tone of it is not messianic, but this verse is very much a messianic one. And Zion was the sacred hill upon which the temple, which had yet to be built, at least in David's day, by this time it would have been built, but that was the center of the house and the dwelling of Elohim, the temple, where he made his sacred presence most manifest on earth. Of course, many Jews came to the extreme conception that his presence could be contained in 4 walls and houses built by man, but the prophet Isaiah in 66:1 refutes that notion by saying he is the maker of the heaven and earth. How can you even presume to contain him in a man-made building? And this is repeated by Stephen in his temple sermon, which ultimately at the behest and consent of Saul earns his execution, but the message must have rubbed off on Paul when we find him witnessing in the Areopagus of Athens in the 17th chapter in the book of Acts. So that is a little far ahead of us. It's New Testament, but there's also this verse is very far-sighted, as we have already explained. It looks forward to the Redeemer, the Savior, their source of salvation, and the captivity, which would be even closer. And that's all the time we have for today. Thank you so much. I'm so glad you're here. Stay tuned till next time. Take care until then. Bye-bye.